Board wargaming, as opposed to miniatures, is really the house that Charlie Roberts built. Now, of course, there were some fairly rudimentary earlier attempts, like the American Heritage series from Milton Bradley, before Charlie Roberts published what we'd consider the first board wargame published commercially in the United States, at least. That's 1954, and the game is Tactics. Now, it wouldn't be until 1958 when the game Gettysburg was released, hilariously advertised on actual billboards, that board wargaming would see a board wargame based on an actual historical event or set of events. In that period of the late 50s through almost the end of the 1960s, Avalon Hill was very close to the only game in town. Rand was publishing in that era, and in the very late 60s, SPI Incorporated in New York City got started, and they made a huge impact. That's what I would start to call the second generation of board war games. But the second generation is where wargame really blossoms. That's where we start to see other publishers enter the mix, aside from the then established Avalon Hill and these new kids in New York City and SPI. We start to see Game Designers Workshop and People's War Games and Marshall Enterprises and a number of other important publishers arise in the 1970s and have a huge impact. Then in very early 1982, the sun suddenly and somewhat unexpectedly set. The assets of SPI were more or less taken over in a story that is too long for me to cover in this video by TSR. And let's say TSR does not come off of that story as anything other than villains. This did a lot to create the perception that board wargaming was a dying enterprise. Avalon Hill is hanging on and would continue to hang on until 1998, but a lot of the traditional wargaming publishers like GDW started increasingly emphasizing other things starting in the very late 70s through the mid-80s. Through the 80s, a whole pile of additional publishers like 3W had arisen, but it would be hard to characterize those as being enormously commercially successful. Now, in 1990, another new company shows up. That's GMT Games out of California. Their first game, Silver Bayonet, was followed by a number of other what appeared to be fairly successful titles, but due to some issues and a really soft market, DMT found itself in a considerable amount of trouble over the years. They implemented a system that's used very broadly, not quite universally, but very broadly in board war games today, that GMT calls the P500 system, and it's essentially a pledge to buy the game when it becomes available. You're not forking over any money right now when you plug the thing into their website, but you are signing up for it, and they will bill you when the game becomes available, or at least when it's about to get off the boat. Now, this basic pre-order method has been adopted by a bunch of other companies and has probably done more than any other single thing to save the bacon of the entire board wargaming hobby for quite a long time, until we began in the 21st century to see something that looked an awful lot like a board game boom. Now, board war games are board games, and that boom contributed to the success and revival of war games, board war games, as a thriving thing, at least here in the United States. If you go to the UK, you're going to find that when you say the term war games, most people will interpret that to mean miniatures games. And actually, I think that's true to some extent here in the U.S. as well, but here the term seems to be more identified, to me at least, with board war games. But, my personal history has a lot to do with that. When the pandemic hit, a lot of these folks who were playing these games found out that it was possible to do it online through platforms like Vassal or Tabletop Simulator, and that did nothing but increase the demand for play of board war games. And here we are, sort of post-pandemic, right? In a situation where we have what I think can be described, has been described by a number of people, not just me, as a second golden age of board war games. If the first golden age is probably the period about 1975 to 1982. In that time, we saw the rise of a number of really interesting, innovative publishers. SPI had found its feet by then and was producing a lot of top-notch stuff that remains near legendary in status today. Now, I started hobby gaming, what I'll call hobby gaming, which kind of just means gamers who were kind of serious about it. In 1980, the game was Paratroop in Strategy and Tactics magazine. So my first hobby game of any kind was actually an S&T game, but I was also 9. So I was obviously not able to go out and buy any games, and even to the limited extent that I would be able to a couple of years later. By then, SPI had disappeared and had been absorbed by TSR, and TSR put out a decent number of titles under the SPI label. It was kind of a sub-brand of TSR, and some of those games actually hold up reasonably well. A lot of them are SPI classics. Some of them are less rememberable. So by the time I really started getting into it, what was available was largely Avalon Hill. Other stuff was less easy to find, where you might find at Avalon Hill games at Sears or large chain toy stores. I left war games aside largely because of availability, probably around 1990, but a couple of years later I started playing them again with some people that I was also doing RPG stuff with. Around the late 90s, though, as I best of my recollection, the wargame publishers had begun to disappear from these sort of large multi-purpose conventions like Origins and Gen Con, and it certainly appeared to me that the wargaming hobby was going away. That was not at any time the actual case, but it was a perception that I and a lot of other people had at the time. So I got out of it. I sold a bunch of my stuff off, fortunately not all of it, because some of that stuff I have indeed rebought since then. But right around 2007 or so, I started deciding that all my hobbies kind of revolved around history and that kind of thing, and I started getting interested in war games again. So of course I went out and said to myself, well, yes, it's ASL, because I know people are still playing that. So I started looking on YouTube and finding there's like people doing YouTube videos about this. What the hell is going on? Right around 2009, I'd already had a YouTube channel by that point covering video games. But about that point, around 2009, I started doing war game videos. And while I continued to do video game stuff for a while and have actually still like a couple hundred videos at the beginning of the channel's history on various video game playthroughs and stuff, the channel was relatively quickly, over the course of a couple of years, kind of taken over by tabletop war games. And now we fast forward to 2023, where we remain in the midst of our second golden age of tabletop wargaming. And I find myself running a YouTube channel that is one of the largest in the relatively small fishbowl that is tabletop wargaming YouTubers. So if this has been even mildly interesting, I do have a link tree in the bio which leads you to all the socials and YouTube and the channel and all that other stuff. I do a weekly live show on Monday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Usually runs about 2 hours, where we talk about war games, tabletop war games. We don't really do a lot with miniatures because I don't do a lot with miniatures. It gets mentioned from time to time and I say very little about it. We do cover RPGs as well, although that Monday show is largely focused on tabletop war games. The RPGs that I'm interested in nowadays, just because of the limited bandwidth I have available for anything, really amounts to whatever Chaosium's doing and Traveler. So anyway, check it out. I figured I would just rant for 8 or so minutes here on TikTok. Follow me here on TikTok. Trying to get up to 1,000 subscribers so I can go live here too. We're a long ways off. So follow me here and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you find that interesting as well.